Okay. I like to, I hope I finish it tonight. I like to present, many people are studying Maseches Kedushin, but that there's a mitzvah, or is there a mitzvah, and what the mitzvah actually is I found it an amazing journey. And for me, it was, it revealed how much I didn't know. I'm not sure how much I do know. We'll see. Now, even before we start, there's a translation of the Arabic here. And if you open up to, it's even in Kapach also, it's Kapach in both of them in Tibbin. And they say that the mitzvah, and I just, frankly, with you, I'll explain to you why I say what I'm saying, but I just cannot read their translation. What they said, or how they translated, I think internally is incongruous. Hatzivui shenitztavinu liv-o b'kiddushin. So these are very strange words, liv-o b'kiddushin. And what they did is, and I don't know, from a scholastic academic point of view, I don't know exactly how to classify it. What they did is they plagiarized, obviously it's not a fair word. They took the Lashon of the Rambam, the Mina Mitzvah Kotzer, and they pasted it over here. And they were not interested in the to portray the Arabic phrase, but they were interested in just copying the Rambam in the Mina Kotzer. The problem is, besides the question is, what is the Rambam saying? What's the translation? Copying the Rambam and placing it over here doesn't make much sense. Because, frankly, I'll talk about this later, if I get to it. What exactly does livo b'kiddushin mean? It's a very strange phrase. We have no clue of what he's talking about, okay? So, but certainly there's something about beer over here.
Frozen.
What?
For a second, it was like you were frozen.
I'm sorry, I was frozen? Okay. So there's something about beer in this livo b'kiddushin. But I would have assumed, but see, then it says, well, let's continue the rest and see how it all fits in. Uvamatan dovo biado isha, I assume that's kesef, or bishtar, or beer. So how can you start off with a phrase and end off with the same thing afterwards and have a list of things coming through? In plain, ungrammatical English, don't make no sense. Okay? So we'll have to see what livo b'kedusha means in Mina Kotzer, Mitzvah Hashem, but to transplant it over here and call this a translation of the Rambam, I think is very unfair to the Rambam. Okay, so now, let's see. Now, how to go about translating it. The word in the original Arabic is akad al nebach. Al is with a hey yediyah like nebach. No, excuse me, nechach. Nun chof aleph ches. So there's a dictionary by a gentleman. He's probably the Judeo-Arabic expert, Bloy, and he claims that the translation is just Kedushin. Kapach translates the words from the Arabic in his footnote, but not in the text. And he says what it means is a kinyan of ishus, a kinyan for beer, as opposed to a kinyan of mekhu memka. Kinyan l'tzorach bias ishus. So you're talking about some kinyan l'tzorach bias ishus, or kol kedushin, and then there's a colon. He shetzibonu b'kiddushin, he shetzibonu b'kiddushin l'tzorchei biyah, or b'kinyan l'tzorch biyah, and then there's a colon, and I assume that this next vav is a vav hamachalik, not a vav mechaber, and it's or. 3 possibilities. Or it's loses, dova biad ho'isha, which is kesef, or it's bishtar, or babiyah. So there's 3 options. There is a mitzvah called kiddushin, and there's 3 ways of doing it: kesef, shtar, and biyah. This, at least you can read it, and it makes sense. So that's what I would suggest to translate it as. Okay. Now, let's continue. Then it says like this. V'zui mitzvahs kiddushin, v'remez omru ki yikach ish isha. Ish isha. Ubala. So that, I guess, is the mitzvah. Ki yikach ish isha ubala. Okay. Now, what I want to point out to you is, before we start, these words, ki yikach ish isha, is found in the Torah 3 times, 3 different settings, and each has its own context. But if you study the psukim, it fails a certain test. And the test is what the Ram says in Shiur Shmini, that a mitzvah is an imperative. And the Rambam in Shiur Shmini has a long linguistical discussion, quoting one of the Arabic linguists, or it was called, like, I think, the second teacher. He was a student of Aristocrates, what they call Aristotle, calling Socrates and Plato and Aristotle together. Whatever it is, the Ram talks about commands in language, and a mitzvah is a command. A priori, ki yikach ish isha, the Torah is telling you a story, and we'll see it's a backdrop for a certain context. And you find it in 3 different cases. The first case, in Dvorim Chav Beis, Perek Chav Beis, at least the prokim, that the general way we refer to Tanakh, even though it was a Goy clergyman who actually set up this thing. Chav Beis Yud Gimel Yud Daled. Ki yikach ish isha udbo eleh usneya. V'som lo alilos dvorim. V'hotzi oleh shemra. V'yomer es isha azeis lokachti v'ekov eleh v'lemotzasi l'psulim. So this is Motzi Shemra. That's the first case. So it's Torah is telling you a story. Second case, ki yikach ish isha uba'alo, the Apostle of the Ram quotes here, v'oyim lo simsachein be'enov, and for some reason he's not happy with her, ki motza bo'er v'zdova, whether that's bedavka or not getting involved in the issues between the Tanoim about this, because of law Sefer Krisus, and it's about a get. That is the pasuk the Ram is quoting here. And the third case, so this is the Parsha of Gershon, and the Parsha of Machzek Gushasei. The third case, which certainly has nothing to do with anything, I would assume, is a posik in Dvorim Chav Daled, so Aleph and Beis. Ki yikach ish isha chadosha, lo yetze batzovo, v'lo yavo lo v'chol dovo, no ki yeh leveisai, shona achas, v'simach es ishtoi, asher lokach. He should give his wife his undivided attention, and that's for the whole year. It's the chiyuv of a chosel l'sameach ishtoi, shekinsa l'shona t'mima, for a complete year. Now, to extrapolate from any one of these psukim, a tzivui, an imperative about kedushin, is not a simple task. Not at all. So we'll have to understand how the Ram did this, almost like a magician trick. In fact, the Rosh points out in Ksuvas, in Perek Aleph, Siman Yud Beis, he says the following: V'nogu ho'idno mekadesh Yisrael de chupa v'kiddushin. He says that is the nusach of the bracha. It's only a minig. It seems what the chsima is changed during time, which is actually true, but that's not what we're dealing with. Yesh makshin on nusach bracha zu. Lo mei mevocha shekel shem mitzvah mitzvah l'kadesh leisha. Why do you make a bracha? Like any bracha, any birchas mitzvah. The Rosh says, "V'niguli ki bracha zo eino bracha la'asiyas mitzvah." It's not a bracha, a birchas mitzvah. Ki pirya v'rivya hainu kiyuma mitzvah. The mitzvah is pirya v'rivya. There's no mitzvah kedushin. V'melokach pilegesh v'kiyim pirya v'rivya eino mechuyev l'kadesh isha. Af v'chulei, af b'nei seisha l'shem pirya v'rivya. Kivan she'efshel l'kayim mitzvah pirya v'rivya. Even if he marries the woman l'shem pirya v'rivya, but it's possible l'kayim pirya v'rivya al kedushin. And then he goes on and he discusses shchita and other things and compares it. But the bottom line is, he says, "Avol hocha efshel kain pir v'rivya b'lo kiddushin v'gam hosam afke kro b'lo shen tzivui dichsiv v'zvachte v'chalto avol hocha ksiv ki yikach ish." And there's no tzivui over here. So the Rosh claims, and it's basically taking the Rambam's to exactly what we expect the Rambam to do. There's no tzivui over here. Mitzvahs are tzivuyim, as he clearly says in Shiur Shmini. So the Rosh says there's no mitzvah kiddushin. And even more so, you can ask that the Torah is not introducing the ki kach ish isha in any of the three contexts as a tzivui to do something, but it's a context for something else. It's a context for Motzi Shemra, it's a context for Gerushin, and it's a context for the mitzvah of V'simach Azishtai. But in itself, to call it a mitzvah, so I'm telling you, there are two issues over here. One issue is there's no imperative in the pasuk, and the second issue is the context of the pasuk is a prepositional phrase telling us about a certain episode, which is a context for three different scenarios in the Torah. So to make this into a mitzvah, you have to be a magician. The Rosh claims that the bracha is not a birkas hamitzvah. So the Rambam we'll flip it. And he, working with the Meseira of the Rif, claims that it is a Birchas HaMitzvah. The Ram in Hilchos Ishus, Per Gimel, Chof Gimel, call Mekadesh Isha, Beina the Atzma, and the Shliach, Tzorch Levorech Koidem HaKidushin, Hu O Shluchai, Ve'achach Mekadesh, Kederch Shemavochen Koidem Kol HaMitzvos, V'im Kiddush Lebeich, Lo Yevorech HaKidushin, Sezuboch HaVatorah, Ma Shenase Kvar Nase. It's a plain Birchas HaMitzvah. So that would have been. So the Ram could have taken the following approach. He himself, the Ram's opinion is that Birchas HaMitzvah is a proof that there's a mitzvah. In fact, he says this in Shorish Aleph, that this is the reason, because of the bracha of Hadlachas Ner Chanukah or Mikra Megillah, is the reason why the Bahag counted as Minyan HaMitzvahs, and it would have been a good idea, but it really means Shekiddush HaMitzvah means the mitzvah of Lishmor Divrei Chacham Loisas. Okay, but generally, Shekiddush HaMitzvah means it's a mitzvah. So this he could have quoted, would have been a very nice proof. He also used this argument in Mitzvah Kuf Samach Aleph, in the Mitzvah Sfira Sa'ima, discussing that since the Bracha Achas for the Sfira, there's really one mitzvah. It's not two mitzvahs, mitzvah min neyomne, mitzvah min shvuah. So the Bracha in the Rambam's frame of reference is can certainly be used as a proof. I would suggest that the Rambam felt it was not necessary to bring a raya. And it's very interesting. In the Rambam's own frame of reference, it's imperative to bring a raya because there's no tzivui in the pasuk. However, the Kadmonim do quote this as a mitzvah, and the Ram says, I assume there's a precedent. He's not working hard. In some mitzvahs, he's working hard to prove there's a mitzvah. Here, there's no work at all. He quotes a pasuk and goes on. I assume he's working off the Bahag, which is not so great, because the Bahag he has three separate categories. He has hasholais or various einshim that are mitzvahs, or the various situations that they're all einshim, and that's the way he lists them. Then he lists mitzvahs Aseh as mitzvahs kumvaseh. Then he has parshas. Kiddushin and gerushin he quotes as parshas lekuchin v'gerushin. And the Rambam basically says in Sefer HaMitzvos, and so does the Ramban, say they don't understand what the Bahag means with his parshas. Okay. Maybe better than that is Rav Sadi going in his Sefer HaMitzvos, which was recently published, put together from scraps of Geniza. In Perek Asiri, on page 83, he says, HaPerek Asiri, mitzvahs or ishos, the mitzvahs that you have to deal with women. Reishis chayvoisov, shoaish mekadesh es isha, bekesef shtar ubir. Okay. This is very interesting and very tantalizing. And I'm going to come back to this in Mitzvah Shem. I hope we'll get to this further later. That offhand, the Rav Sadi guy is a paradigm. But the Ram, it's almost like the Ram's copying it. The mitzvah is b'kiddushin, and kiddushin's done b'kesef shtar u'b'biyah. Okay. So that's what we have. So it's I can't. I'm not here to be a defense attorney for the Rambam. I assume that there should have been, to some extent, some proof over here, which is lacking. But this is what he's presenting it. This is the way he's presenting it, and there is a let's say historical context that the Kamonim had it as a mitzvah. And I assume that the Rambam himself, in context of the fact that there's a Birkas HaMitzvah, assumed that there's a mitzvah over here, assumed the historical context of the Rif and the other Kadmonim that assumed this is a Birkas HaMitzvah, not like the Rosh. And then there's an amazing thing. Because the Rambam says certain mitzvahs he calls a shrana, which is like religious law, which the Rambam does in mitzvah Tzadihei to mitzvah Kovches, and the mitzvahs at the end of the mitzvah say the last 20 mitzvahs, the mitzvah of Shoy Mechinum, Shoy Mesocha, Shoyel, Mekrumemka. They're just religious law with no imperative that you have to do it. But the assumption is, since the Torah has religious law, we are supposed to do it, which is an amazing thing. And that's the Rambam seems to say. And he doesn't go out of his way to explain it. Maybe, in Tzadihei a little bit, but okay. But the Rambam doesn't call Kiddushin religious law. The Rambam says it's Amal, and that's the Arabic right over here for Al-Amal, Amalna, which is the Arabic for a bona fide imperative command. So that's also amazing. I assume that if there's a Birkas HaMitzvah, so l'cheira then the Matiki Ashmua, those who had the Kabbalah from Moshe Sinai, and the Ram assumes the Kabbalah also about Taryag Mitzvahs, that there was a Kabbalah that Kiddushin is a mitzvah. Okay? So that means even though the Pasuk says Ki Yikach as a prepositional phrase, the Matiki Ashmua says not only you should interpret in context of its flow as an introduction to Gerushin, but should be interpreted as a imperative and kilu interpreting the Pirush Makubal, which doesn't hang well with the Pshuto Shel Mikra. But it's happening over here, an amazing thing, and the Ram doesn't feel it necessary to explain this at all. Okay. Now, that's what we have. Now, this is what the Rambam is presenting in Minyan HaMitzvos. In Mishnah Torah and in the Protei Mitzvos, the Rambam presents a different story. Just want to show, before we start getting into things, what the spectrum of different options and possibilities that exist over here. The Rambam Mishnah Torah clearly says that the mitzvah of Kiddushin is not standing as an isolated phenomenon, and talks about its relationship to Nisuin. Okay? In here, in Minyan HaMitzvos, there's no mention at all of Nisuin. So let's proceed. The Rambam in Perek Aleph, Halach Aleph and Beis, tells you a story, a historical context that Kedushin is coming from. Koydem Matan Torah, hoye odem pagei isha b'shuk. Im rotzehu v'hi lisa oisa. If there was mutual consent, that's who v'hi lisa oisa. Machnisa lebeisai, he brings him into his house. Bala beinoi levein atzmoi, without any edim, v'tia lo leisha. Even shenitna Torah, however, things change with Matan Torah. Nitztavu Yisrael, see again, very clear the word nitztavu. Nitztavu Yisrael, shim yirtze or ish, lisa isha. In other words, if you want to marry a woman, there was a tzivah to do something beforehand. Shim yirtze ish, lisa isha, yikna isa tchila. There should be some type of kinyan issues prior to the nesuin. And this should be b'fnei Edom. V'achar kach tiyeh lo isha. And then he can make her his wife. Now, here's the catch over here. What pasuk does the Rambam quote in Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph? And what pasuk does the Rambam quote over here in Minyan HaMitzvos? Remember, over here in Minyan HaMitzvos, he quotes Ki yikach ish isha u'ba'alo, and that is the discussion and prior to Gerushin, okay? Here in Mishnah Torah, he quotes the Ki yikach ish isha of Motzi Shemra. And look what he says. Shene'emar Ki yikach ish isha ubo eleho. Okay. So how do you translate the words? Ki yikach ish isha ubo eleho. So ubo eleho, I assume, is the nesuin, because he's saying, that's what he said. He said prior, what was the Torah's mechadesh is prior to the normal process of Nisuin, of Bulas Baal, which existed before Matan Torah. There should be prior to the Bulas Baal, there should be a kinyan of Kedushin. So that's what he's saying. Ki yikach ish isha, which is the kinyan Kedushin, and then uboilel. Okay. So this uboileho is not the bia of Kiddushin, it's the bias ishas after the Kiddushin. This is very odd in terms of Pshuta Shemikah. It's almost mind-boggling, because you read the pasuk, you would have said a completely different story over here. Ki yikach ish isha ubo eleh usneya. It means this is a setup. We don't know what he did actually. It's a setup for Motzi Shemra. V'somer alilas dvorim, v'hoitzi aleho Shemra, v'yomer esel isha zeis lakachti, v'ekov eleh lotzas lo. So I'm not sure if he actually did the bia or he didn't do it, but let's even assume he did. But this bia is not a setup for the Nisuin, but it's a setup for a Motzi Shemra. And the Ram quotes this pasuk almost out of context and says that he basically is an issue of it basically is an issue of this is the mitzvah of Kiddushin. And the Chiddush of the Torah is that the Kiddushin, and this basically what he's learning, that the Torah is talking about, that he came for Kavanah of Nesuin, and that's the mitzvah. And the Maisa is, he claims Alilus Dvom, which is an amazing shot in Pasuk. But if you take the Rambam and you try to, you have the Pasuk in one hand, that's what happens. In the Prote Mitzvahs, which you'll find at the beginning of Hilchos Ishus, the Prote Mitzvah beginning of Hilchos Ishus, you see, in Mishnah Torah, you could have said the mitzvah is that the Nesuin is not part of the mitzvah at all, but the mitzvah is the Kiddushin, and the mitzvah is that the Kiddushin should precede the Nesuin, and that's the mitzvah. However, in the Prote Mitzvahs, he says, Lisa Isha Biksuva the Kiddushin. The word Ksuva is very odd, and this is not it's beyond the purview of what we're talking about now. Okay, Lisa Isha Biksuva Bikidushin. So the mitzvah, the Lisa Isha is not just we're going back before Matan Torah. There's no mitzvah in the Nesuin. The mitzvah is the conglomerate of the Kedushin plus the Nesuin. And this is very different than what he's presenting here in Minyan HaMitzvos. In Minyan HaMitzvos, the mitzvah is Kedushin. And I understand that the mitzvah is Kedushin, you quote, Ki yikach ish iso bala, and that's the end of the mitzvah. Here, in Mishnah Torah, he's redacted the mitzvah in an amazingly new way, that the mitzvah is a conglomerate of Kedushin plus Nesuin, or if you want to be very strict in the interpretation of what he says in the beginning of Mishnah Torah, in the beginning of Hilchos Ishus, it could be the mitzvah is the Kedushin should precede the Nesuin. Now, before we go further, I'd like to present a certain historical note in two editions of the Rambam Pirush Mishnayos, and you might find it very interesting. This pasuk ubo eleha in Madua Kama in the Pirush HaMishnah in Kiddushin, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. It was changed. He erased one word, he crossed out one word and added a different word. And you'll see what the difference is. V'seida Kiddushin bebir, she'syachir imo b'fnei edim, l'shem Kiddushin. Then he says like this, V'ein Kiddushin yoisem mubo orim me'ela, v'zeh shenishparish b'Torah. This Kiddushin, the Kiddushin beer, was said explicitly in the Torah. Shenema ubo eleha v'sono. Ki yikach ish isha ubo eleha v'sono. The pasuk which the Ram quotes in Mishnah Torah, the boy Ele referring to Nesuin, the Rambam Pirush Mishnayos uses it for Kiddushin beer. And it says, Ki lo das krat in the Torah. Tzach mefurish mevur b'Torah. The interesting thing is, you'll find the same thing in the Chinuch. Maybe he was privy to this, or maybe he was working, I don't know. He says, in Sefer Chinuch, in Mitzvah Tov Kuf Nun Beis, שנצטווינו לקנוס אישה ביחס משלושת דרכים, קודם הנישואין. ודרכים אלו ביאור חכמים שהן בכסף או בשטר או בביאו עולהו. ועל זה נאמר כי ייקח איש אישה ובוא אליה. כלומר, אם יצא איש לקח לו אישה, יקנוס התחילה בביאו. So the chinuch interprets the pasuk of Rambam Madua Kama, which is an amazing shot in the pasuk. Because ve'ekav eleo, and that's the bia from the Kiddush Kedushin. If he didn't find her, if he was Makadesh with bia, then what is he? What's the chiyuv for? That means that beforehand she wasn't his wife. So what's the Motzi Shema? What's the volume? What's the whole issue? The whole thing don't make no sense. The chinuch. Then in Madura Basra, the Rambam does the following, and he crosses out the word usneya and changes it to uba'ala. So he's basically quoting two psukim. It says like this. There, he says, it go like this. V'ein kedushin. He changed a little bit the lashon over here of Yosef. The v'zehu shenisparish b'teir shenema ubo heileho uba'ala. He just knocks out Visana and adds a bala. So it means that he adds another pasuk, which I don't know exactly what the gain and the loss over here. This ubala is certainly what he's using in Sefer Mitzvas as the source for Kedusha. But what he still needs the old pasuk for is very unclear to me. Now, let's go on. Next step. Okay, this I just want to tell you, you should not think the purpose here is to confuse you. Okay, the purpose only is present the information and present the difficulties or how everything fits together. Next, we explained that l'cheira, according to the Rambam here, in Mitzvas, the Mitzvas Kiddushin, and the Mishnah Torah, there's some relationship between the Kiddushin and the Suin. That's what we have. What I like to do is just to do a survey of the Talmud, of how the Talmud talks about Kiddushin or Nisuin as a mitzvah, and then we'll move ahead to see what's happening exactly. And maybe that might be the backdrop. That might be the backdrop of the Rambam. Come on, Kiddushin. Mem Aleph and Aleph. Masnisin. Uish Makadesh bo b'shluchai. Uish Miskadeshes bo ub'shlucha. Uish Makadeshes bo v'chuay. So the Gemara starts like this. Hashta b'shluchai Makadesh bo mi boy. What if they say bo b'shluchai? Amar Rav Yosef mitzvah bo Yosef b'shluchai. So you get the impression there's some mitzvah in the Kedushin itself. It's a foolish mitzvah bo Yosef b'shluchai. What mitzvah are we talking about here? According to the Rosh, we'll have problems with this phrase. The Gemara in Beitza a Mishnah and a Gemara. Lamed Vav Mebeis. Mishnah. Kol shechayvel mishum shvus, mishum mishus, mishum mitzvah. B'Shabbos chayav molov, b'yontif b'chulei. V'elu hein mishum mishus. There's certain shvusim that are rishus, like donim, v'loy mekachim. So it says that a kedushin is called rishus, and in the Mishnah in kedushin. So I'm just now skipping to the Gemara. For the Gemara, v'loy mekachim. How can you say that which is in the Mishnah is rishus? V'hom mitzvah ka'avid. V'hom mitzvah ka'avid. So you have, it's mamish gewaldig. You have the Gemara in Kedushin for mitzvah yosef shlucha, and the Gemara uses the lashon. The Gemara is the kasha. How can you say such a thing? For mitzvah ka'avid. So the Gemara says, like tzircha, now it goes to Lamed Zayim and Aleph, the islay isha uvanim. So the Rosh will say, because it's Mekayim Puruvu, so there's no reason to get involved over here. But if you look carefully at the Lashon, that's very simplistic. Because it says the islay isha uvanim. Why does it say, what do you need, what's the isha have to do with Puruvu? It should have said, the islay bonim. What does it mean, the islay isha bonim? So Pashto means the Islay Isha Bonim means that there is a mitzvah in having the Isha and a mitzvah having the Bonim. But if he has a wife and children, the Kedushin itself is only Rishus. So in fact, I found one of the Achronim, the Pri Yitzchok, in Chelek Aleph, Sivim Mem Aleph, has this diuk of Isha Bonim. Now, two other cases. We'll see what happens. Let's go like this. Let's now do in Psochim. Amishin in Psochim. Mem Testament Aleph. Ahulch lishcheres pischoi v'lomeles benoi v'lechol sudas elusim bebeis chamov. He's going to have a sudas elusim in his father-in-law's house. V'nizka sheish lo chometz b'seich beisai. Im yochol la'arzo levaye v'la'arzo lemitzvosai. Ya'arzo yevaye v'im lav mivat lo belibo. So it's a very interesting word. What does it mean? La'arzo lemitzvosai. See, here's again, you see something that points that there's some mitzvah over here. So the Gemara says like this: V'leminu ha'hoilech lechol sudas elusin v'beis chomov v'lishpois shvisa u'shus yachzu miyad. So the Gemara says there's the Chabraisa that says the opposite, that the sudas elusin is nothing. Rabbi Yochanan lekasha choreb Yehuda Rabbi Yosi. The sign Yisulis Eis in Rishus, Divi Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosi Eime Mitzvah. So there's a Machukas Tanoia about the Sulis Eisin. Vahashta di Omar, Rav Chista Machloikis. He says that the most is like this. What's it? Vahashta di Omar Rav Chista Machloikis, Besuda Shnia. Rav Chista said, the machlik is only in the second Suda of Eisin. Our Besuda we show in the Divya Kol Mitzvah. So I would have said that if the Sudas Eisin is a mitzvah, the Kedushin itself is certainly a mitzvah. So we have one, the Gemara Kedushin, the Gemara in Beitza, and the Gemara in Psochim, all pointing to the fact that there's a mitzvah in Kedusha. Then comes the Gemara Moy Cotton. The Moy Cotton on Yud Ches Amud Beis. Oma Shmuel. Mutter la'aris isha b'chol shel moed. Shem yikadmenu acher. One is allowed, the member from the Amor Shmuel, the one is allowed to marry a woman in Chol HaMoed, because maybe, if someone will catch her first. Okay. Lema Messiah le. Ein noisen noshim b'moed. Loi b'sulas lo amonis lo miyabim. V'nei shesimcha hi loi. Hol ha'ari shoy. So it's only an Isa Nesuin, but Kiddushin is the Chmuta. So the Gemara says, Lo mi boy koma. And this is the important things that become interesting now. Lo mi boy koma, lo mi boy la'ares, deloi ka'ovid mitzvah, el afilu lisonami, the ka'ovid mitzvah osa. See here, the Gemara seems to say the Kedushin by itself is not a mitzvah. So here, in fact, I hope we'll come to this later, there's a tshuva from the Birkas Avram and Siman Mem Daled that he basically concludes like the Rambam in Mishnah Torah against Sefer. Let's not really read it to you now. Let's read it, okay? He says, "V'oisa kusha shehiksheisa al ikad dvorov lo kasha olov shebeminyan ha-mitzvos betchilas halacha." In the, he says the minyan ha-mitzvos betchilas halacha, which is the Protei Mitzvos. That's what he's referring to, the Protei Mitzvos. This is the Rambam's son explaining his father's work. Oma mitzvah lisa isha b'ksuv v'kedushin. V'lo oma l'kadish isha. He didn't say the mitzvah is l'kadish isha. V'chein amrinon lisa isha the kovid mitzvah. And l'chei, what he's doing is he's quoting the Gemara Moy Cotton. And he learns Lisa Isha covered mitzvah because the Kedusha by itself is only the beginning. And the culmination is with the Suin. So you're only doing half a mitzvah kilo. And he seems to be saying that this is the interpretation of Mishnah Torah. Even though he's leaving the Rambam Sefer Mitzvahs hanging, and the Rambam says the mitzvah l'kadosh isha. V'zu she'omar l'kuch the Ram says l'kuchim elu mitzvasei in Mishnah Torah in Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph. So he says, or maybe it's Halacha Beis. Second, here it is. Let's just see. Here we have it. Here we have it. In Halacha Beis, l'kuchen elu hein hanikoin kedushin. L'kuchen elu hein hanikoin kedushin. O erisin b'chol mokem. V'l'kuchen elu, in the beginning of Halacha Beis, Mitzvas Aseh shel Torah aim. Okay. So, the Ram says that Kedushin is a mitzvah. So he says that's not Pshat in the Rambam. He said, Lefi shehi tchilas mitzvahs anisuin, v'kach omer betchila, yikno isa tchila b'fnei edim v'achar kach tia lo leisha, shenema ki yikach ish isha uboy leo. Ava Kedushin b'lo nisuin, and then he goes on his way to disagree with the Rosh without mentioning what he's aware of. The Rosh probably wasn't enough to know the Rosh was born at that time. after he says, "Umitzvah priyuvia mitzvah chesi, shemitzvah priyuvia kshiyi eloi beinoi bas kima mitzvah miskedushim asur afilu yesh lo kama bonim." And then he says, I'm skipping a little bit, I'm reading your line. The ayin b'dvorov zal, referring to the Rambam, b'sefer mitzvahs yisbaya locho ahefresh shebeinehem. And he said, if you look carefully in Minyan HaMitzvos, you'll see that the Rambam Mishnah Torah and the Rambam in Minyan HaMitzvos is of a different opinion. That's what he's saying. Okay, now, next. So, basically, the three Gemaras that pointed that Kedushin is a mitzvah. There's a Gemara Moikotin, which seems to say Kedushin is not a mitzvah. And what the Rambam ben Rambam seems to say is this might have been the push of the Rambam to change in Mishnah Torah and say that the mitzvah is Kedushin plus Nisuin. The Ramban also is of this opinion. The Ramban Ksuvas, Adav Zayin Amabeis, seems to be clear the mitzvah is Kedushin plus Nisuin, and each one is a Chatzi mitzvah. The oid shafilu chupa the raisa kivut shachup bekedushin eno nasim bebas achas v'chatzi mitzvah nasis bekedushin chutzach levorach aleim mekadosh Yisrael shekol mitzvah levorach aleim over l'asiyos. So the Ramban says there are two parts, and the reason you make the bracha is because the chuppah, it's chdupa plus kedusha. That's the mitzvah. The same thing what Rav Avram ben Rambam suggests in the Rambam. Now, I'm going to do something. I hope I have time to finish at least this part. Okay. If you recall, the Rambam a few mitzvahs before, when he's talking about the mitzvah of Chosen and the Tirda and the P'tur Krishma, he brings a raya that's the mitzvah's Puruvu, because the P'tur mitzvah of Isaac b'mitzvah, he learns that Isaac b'mitzvah is when you're being Isaac in a mitzvah. And there's a P'tur of Isaac b'mitzvah when you're Torah in the mitzvah. And it has to be mitzvah say. So he brings a raya in the mitzvah puruvu, that is a mitzvah say puruvu from the P'tur Chosen and Krishma. That's what he says. Yeah. In mitzvah ratio days, he quotes. Va'abiro. She'ena choseh chaya b'kriyishma im nosa b'sura. V'notnu tam lakach b'bnei shu oisik b'mitzvah. For this boy, and this l'chayr is a raya that's a mitzvah puruvu. Okay. The Ram does this same act again, the same exact thing, in Pirush Mishnayos. I think I mentioned to you that, in the Goyim, that you're not royer than the Goyim of a Choson for Shivis Mea Mishnah. The Ram says, because he's Isaac Mitzvah Puruvu. Rabbi Nachnano, in Moikoten, of Zion, he says that the mitzvah is the mitzvah of Simcha, of the mitzvah of Simcha, I guess, is Jewish Shivis Mea Mishnah. That's what he assumes. The Ram is amazing because the Rama Pasha is a Pirush Mishnayis in the Goyim that Puruvu has to be done besimcha, we can't be melancholy. And since having a negi is going to be melancholy, therefore we don't see him because he's Aseh Mitzvah Puruvu. What I want to point out, and this is the interesting part over here. It is possible that once the Rambam in Mishnah Torah has said that the Mitzvah's Kiddushin is not Kiddushin as an isolated phenomenon, but it's a conglomerate of Kiddushin plus Nesuin, so then you have the option of suggesting that the Oisik b'mitzvah is all part of the Nesuin, and the Shiva Simei HaMishta is also working from the mitzvah Nesuin. If there's no mitzvah Nesuin and the mitzvah Kiddushin, as here in Minyan HaMitzvos, so Mamela the Rambam places the case of Chosin in the mitzvah Pri-Rivya, as he does in Minyan HaMitzvos. But Mishnah Torah, the language that he has when he refers to the P'tur Chosin is a little different. And the Tzlach is amazed at the language, and he asked the question, and maybe this will explain everything. Let me just read you some of them. In Perek Dalet of Hilchos Kriyas Shema, Halacha Aleph and Beis, Lefika Chosin Shenosa Psula Poter Mikriyas Shema Ad Shiyavo Olevo. Only says that he married a Psula. It doesn't say whether he was Mekayim Pri-Rivya or not. There's no issue. Just any guy, he has 15 children. He marries another woman who's a Psula, and he's Poter. Why? What's the Aseh b'mitzvah? What's the Torah b'mitzvah? Lefi shein daita pulu yishem lo yimsol b'sulim. Im sho ad motzoi Shabbos lo yibol chayiv likus mid motzoi Shabbos erch shein iskar daita lo gasmo avu pi shelo yibol. Avu anoise zabul avu pi she'isik b'mitzvah. Nothing to do with the noise. What mitzvah? Noise b'sul, noise b'mitzvah. It's a mitzvah in the Mishnah Torah. So he's turned the world upside down. Chayiv likos hoil v'eloi mashi mebalbo, because there's no Torah. Now comes the Tzlach. You understand in the Tzlach and Brachos Tezayin on Aleph, Tivya Mascho Shom Chosin Poter Mikrish Matam Mishum Tila the Mitzvah. Voyinira the Hainu b'Mishal Kim Adayim Mitzvah Rivya. V'cheinu b'Ferish Mishnayis the Rambam. I forgot to mention this. The Rambam is also Pirish Mishnayis like he. I think I probably mentioned to you when we were learning Minyan HaMitzvos over there Pri-Rivya. V'zel Shene v'Hushiyeh B'Inyan Hahu Misaseg Mitzvah. What's the Mitzvah Pri-Rivya? Akan Shen Rabbeinu. V'Tamani Shelo Isi B'Shum Echem HaPrisim She'askiru Chiluk Zeh. V'Rabbeinu Atzmai Ot HaRambam B'Chibur Perek Dalet Mikrish V'Lo Chiluk B'Zeh Klau. V'Ula Kivich Kvar Nosa Isa B'Chupa Chai V'Ula Kai Mitzvahs Oina. That's what he's talking about, Mitzvahs Oina. U'B'Be'ilu Yishayna Torah Tirda the Mitzvah Zu Shel Oina V'Adayin Tzorach Talmud. But if you learn that the Ezra ben Chanano, that the Simcha of Nesuin throughout the Shiva, and this Simcha of the Tilda and the Bia, of which is the Bia of Nesuin, so then the Rambam is a whole different story. So all I'm telling you is the change in Mishnah Torah gives him an opportunity to make a complete break with what he did here in Minyan HaMitzvos. The Mitzvah Shem will pick up next week. I'm sorry I didn't get very far, but I hope it was somewhat understandable.